This is definitely by far the oldest case that I've been associated with.
We couldn't imagine anyone wanting to do anything like that to her.
May 14th, 1976. A quiet street in Oklahoma City is shattered by an unthinkable discovery. Inside a modest duplex, 68-year-old Layla Mae Johnston, a loving grandmother, a retired social worker who spent her life helping others, lies dead. She has been raped and strangled in her own home. No forced entry. Nothing stolen. Just a senseless act of violence that would haunt her family and baffle investigators for decades. Her killer thought time was on his side. He thought the passing years would bury his crimes forever, but he didn't count on the relentless march of science or the dedication of detectives who refused to let Layla's case go cold. This is the story of how cutting-edge DNA technology finally gave voice to evidence that had waited patiently for nearly half a century. This is the story of how justice caught up with a killer, even from beyond the grave.
I just couldn't believe it. After all these years, to finally have an answer.
But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask you a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensure you don't miss out on any new videos. Oklahoma City in 1976 was a place where people still left their doors unlocked, where neighbors knew each other by name, and where violent crime was something that happened somewhere else. The 3600 block of N. Robinson Avenue was lined with modest duplexes, each housing families who had built their lives around trust and community. Among them lived Layla Mae Johnston, a 68-year-old grandmother whose life embodied the very best of that trusting era. Born in Texas during the tumultuous years following World War I, Layla had built a life dedicated to service. Until just months before her death, she worked at the state welfare department, where colleagues remembered her as the kind of person who would stay late to help a family in need. Her retirement should have been the beginning of her golden years, a time to focus on the simple joys she loved most: sewing clothes for her grandchildren, tending to her small garden, and sharing stories over afternoon tea. Those who knew Layla described her as the heartbeat of her family. Her granddaughter would later recall how visits to grandmother's duplex were a weekly highlight, filled with the warmth of fresh-baked cookies and the gentle whir of her sewing machine. She was always making something for someone, her granddaughter remembered. That's just who she was. Always giving, always caring.
My grandmother was a very loving, caring person. She sewed fantastic. She made all my school clothes. She cared for her yard and her home. We would visit at least once a week, just spending time with her, telling stories. I felt that she was an integral part of my life.
Her home reflected her character, modest but meticulously maintained, with curtains she'd sewn herself and family photos adorning every wall. The ground floor duplex wasn't fancy, but to Layla, it was paradise. She had created a sanctuary where family gathered, where neighborhood children knew they could find a sympathetic ear, and where her own boundless love for others shone through in every detail. But beneath the serenity of this picture-perfect life, a shadow was about to fall. The same trusting nature that made Layla beloved in her community would ultimately make her vulnerable to an unimaginable act of violence. The unlocked doors that symbolized neighborhood trust would soon become a tragic reminder of how times were changing. No one could have predicted that spring morning would be the last time neighbors would see Layla tending to her cherished garden. No one could have known that the community's sense of security was about to be shattered forever. The stage was set for a tragedy that would not only claim an innocent life, but would also launch one of Oklahoma's most enduring mysteries.
Officers get a call to a resident inside of her duplex found by the neighbors.
The morning of May 14th, 1976 began like any other on N. Robinson Avenue. The spring air was warm, birds were chirping, and neighbors went about their usual routines. But something was off. Layla's curtains remained drawn well past her usual wake-up time. Her morning ritual of checking the mail and watering her beloved garden never happened. The absence of these small, everyday movements sent ripples of concern through the close-knit community. By afternoon, the worry had grown into genuine fear. A neighbor, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, decided to check on Layla. What they discovered would haunt them for the rest of their lives. There, in her own home, the place that should have been her sanctuary, lay Layla Mae Johnston's lifeless body. The police response was swift. As patrol cars pulled up to the duplex, neighbors gathered in small clusters on their porches, watching in disbelief as crime scene investigators filed in and out of Layla's home. The area was quickly cordoned off with yellow tape, transforming a peaceful street into a crime scene that would perplex investigators for decades to come. Inside, detectives found a scene that defied explanation. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting Layla either knew her killer or that they had entered through an unlocked door, a common practice in the neighborhood at the time. Nothing appeared to be stolen. Her purse sat untouched. Her jewelry remained in place. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. The killer had come with far more sinister intentions. The medical examiner's findings were grim. Layla had been raped and strangled. The violence of the attack stood in stark contrast to the gentle soul who had lived there. Even veteran detectives were shaken by the brutality inflicted on an elderly woman who had spent her life helping others. "It made no sense," recalled one of the original investigating officers speaking years later. Here was this kind, elderly lady who wouldn't hurt a fly. She had no enemies. Everyone loved her. Why would anyone do this? The neighborhood reacted with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Doors that had never known a lock were suddenly bolted shut. Parents called their children inside before sunset. The trust that had defined their community was replaced by fear and suspicion. Who among them could have committed such a heinous act? For Layla's family, the news was devastating. Her granddaughter, who had visited just days before, struggled to comprehend how someone could harm her beloved grandmother.
It was devastating. We were extremely upset and confused because they didn't take anything from the house. They just took her life.
It wasn't just that we lost her, she would later say. It was how we lost her, the violence of it. It was impossible to understand. As news of the murder spread through Oklahoma City, it became clear that this wasn't just another crime. It was an attack on everything their community stood for: trust, safety, and the belief that good people were protected by their own goodness. But the worst part was yet to come. The killer had left almost no traces behind, except for one crucial piece of evidence that wouldn't reveal its secrets for nearly half a century. The Oklahoma City Police Department mobilized quickly, but from the start, investigators knew they were facing an uphill battle. In 1976, crime scene analysis was still primitive by today's standards. No DNA testing, no advanced fingerprint databases, no surveillance cameras to review. Detectives had to rely on old-school police work, door-to-door canvassing, witness interviews, and careful examination of physical evidence. Detective James Miller, one of the first investigators assigned to the case, later recalled the frustrating nature of the crime scene. "Everything was neat, almost too neat," he said. "It was like the killer knew exactly what he was doing, how to avoid leaving traces." But despite their best efforts to be careful, criminals always leave something behind. In this case, they had recovered crucial biological evidence. Though its true value wouldn't be realized for decades to come, The investigation's first 48 hours were critical. Detectives interviewed dozens of neighbors, trying to piece together Layla's final days. Several reported seeing her working in her garden just 2 days before, appearing happy and at peace. No one had heard anything unusual on the night of the murder. No screams, no signs of struggle. It was as if evil had slipped in and out like a ghost. The hardest part was telling the family we had no solid leads, remembered Detective Miller. The lack of forced entry suggested Layla either knew her killer or that they had entered through an unlocked door, a common practice in the trusting neighborhood. But this only widened the pool of potential suspects while providing no clear direction. The crime lab worked tirelessly, processing fingerprints found throughout the duplex. But in an era before computerized databases, each print had to be compared manually to known offenders. Hair samples were collected, fibers were analyzed, and every inch of the crime scene was photographed. Yet each potential lead seemed to evaporate as quickly as it appeared. Perhaps most frustrating was the complete absence of witnesses. In a neighborhood where people typically kept their windows open in the spring weather, not a single person reported hearing or seeing anything suspicious. It was as if the killer had chosen his moment perfectly, striking when the street was at its quietest. As days turned into weeks, the case began to cool. Tips that initially flooded the police hotline slowed to a trickle. The family's hopes for quick justice faded with each passing day. But unknown to everyone at the time, the most important piece of evidence, that crucial biological sample, had been carefully preserved, waiting for science to catch up with justice. The weeks turned into months, the months into years, and Layla Mae Johnston's case slowly gathered dust in the Oklahoma City Police Department's cold case files. But for her family, time didn't dull the pain. It only deepened the wound of not knowing. Every holiday gathering, every family milestone was marked by her absence. And the haunting question, who had taken her from them?
I thought would never be finished. It had been so long. It had been, the little gnawing in the back of your head all the time that who did this?
The 1980s came and went. New technologies emerged, offering hope to families of other victims. But Layla's case remained frustratingly opaque. Her file would occasionally be pulled out when similar crimes occurred or when a new detective took interest. But each review ended the same way, with more questions than answers. In the early 1990s, as DNA testing began revolutionizing forensic science, Layla's family dared to hope. The biological evidence collected from the crime scene had been meticulously preserved, thanks to the foresight of those original investigators. But early DNA testing was limited, expensive, and required larger samples than what many old cases could provide. Meanwhile, Oklahoma City changed around them. The quiet neighborhood where Layla had lived became busier, more urban. Many of the original neighbors moved away or passed on, taking their memories of that terrible day with them. The duplex where she'd lived was eventually torn down, replaced by new construction, as if trying to erase the horror of what had happened there. For the detectives who'd worked the case, Layla's murder became the one that got away. Some cases just stick with you, said retired Detective Miller in a 2020 interview. You go home at night and you can't help but think about that gentle grandmother who deserves so much better. You think about her family, still waiting for answers. By the turn of the millennium, most people had forgotten about the murder of Layla Mae Johnston. But in the evidence room of the Oklahoma City Police Department, a small sample of DNA still waited silently, holding secrets that would soon rock the community to its core. The landscape of criminal investigation changed dramatically in 2018 when genetic genealogy burst into the spotlight with the capture of the Golden State Killer. Suddenly, decades-old cold cases had new hope. This revolutionary technique could do something unprecedented: identify suspects through their family trees, even if they'd never been arrested or had their DNA collected. By 2023, the Oklahoma City Police Department's cold case unit decided it was time to try this new approach with Layla's case. They partnered with DNA Labs International, DLI, a private forensic laboratory specializing in the most challenging cold cases. The biological evidence that had waited patiently for 47 years was about to tell its story. When we received Layla's case, we knew we had our work cut out for us, recalled Allison Martin Krensky, DLI's lead genealogist. But there was something about this case, a grandmother murdered in her own home, that made us determined to find answers. The process was painstaking. First, the lab had to extract usable DNA from the decades-old evidence, a delicate process that sometimes fails with aged samples. But Layla's case yielded a surprise. The DNA was remarkably well preserved, thanks to proper storage all those years ago. It was as if those original investigators had somehow known that someday this evidence would be the key. With a viable DNA profile in hand, Martin Krensky began the intricate process of genetic genealogy. Think of it as building a massive family tree in reverse. Instead of starting with a known person and working forward, they started with the DNA and worked backward through generations of connections. The team searched through public genealogy databases, looking for distant relatives who shared snippets of DNA with their unknown suspect. Each match was like a piece of an enormous puzzle. Some led nowhere. Others opened new avenues of investigation. For months, they traced family lines, studied birth certificates, death records, and marriage licenses. It's like finding your way through a maze, Martin Krensky explained. Every wrong turn actually helps you get closer to the right path. You just have to be patient and methodical. The team built out dozens of family trees, connecting dots that span generations and crisscross the country. Then, after more than a year of intensive work, the maze suddenly opened up. Multiple family lines converged on a single name, Charles O'Droke, born February 18, 1948. When investigators ran the name, they discovered something startling. Droke had been dead since 1989, killed by his own brother shortly after the latter's release from prison. But in 1976, Charles Droke had been very much alive, and as investigators were about to confirm, he had been in Oklahoma City, just blocks from Layla's duplex, on that fateful May evening. Charles O'Droke was no stranger to violence. Born in 1948, he'd lived a life marked by trouble, though he'd somehow managed to avoid serious criminal charges. His death in 1989, murdered by his own brother, seemed a fitting end to a life of darkness. But until the DNA results came back, no one had connected him to one of Oklahoma City's most haunting cold cases. When detectives pulled Droke's records, a chilling picture emerged. In 1976, he'd been living just a few blocks from Layla's duplex. He would have known the neighborhood's routines, understood its trusting nature. He would have seen Layla, perhaps watched her tending her garden or returning from the grocery store. The thought sent shivers down the investigators' spines. The final DNA comparison was just a formality, recalled Detective Mike Burke from the cold case unit. But when those results came back as a match, it was still overwhelming. After 47 years, we were finally looking at the face of Layla's killer. The match wasn't just close, it was definitive. The DNA found at the crime scene was unquestionably Charles Droke's. Modern science had finally given voice to evidence that had waited nearly half a century to speak its truth. But the revelation brought with it a bitter irony. Droke had escaped earthly justice, killed in 1989 before DNA technology could catch up with him. His own violent death, shot by his brother in what police at the time ruled a domestic dispute, had come just as DNA testing was beginning to emerge as a forensic tool. In some ways, it feels like he cheated justice twice, said one investigator. first by escaping detection for so long, then by dying before he could be held accountable. Yet there was still power in naming him, in finally being able to tell Layla's family who had taken their beloved grandmother from them. The case also raised haunting questions. Had Layla been Droke's only victim? Given the violence of the crime and his ability to avoid detection, investigators couldn't help but wonder if there were other unsolved cases that might bear his signature. But those answers, if they exist, likely died with him in 1989. What's certain is that on that May evening in 1976, Charles O. Droke committed a crime that would take nearly 5 decades to solve. He likely thought he'd gotten away with it. He couldn't have known that the evidence he left behind would eventually speak, even if he no longer could. The identification of Charles Droke as Layla's killer marked a historic moment for Oklahoma law enforcement. It was the first time the Oklahoma City Police Department had solved a homicide using genetic genealogy, ushering in a new era of cold case investigation. But for Layla's family, the revelation brought mixed emotions. After 47 years, you almost can't believe it, Layla's granddaughter shared, her voice thick with emotion. We finally have a name, a face to put to this nightmare. But he's been dead all these years, never having to answer for what he did to our grandmother. The case changed more than just one family's story. It sent ripples through the law enforcement community, proving that even decades-old cases could be solved with persistence and new technology. This success prompted the Oklahoma City Police Department to review other cold cases, looking for those where preserved DNA evidence might tell similar tales. For DNA Labs International and their dedicated team, Layla's case became a testament to the power of genetic genealogy. Every case solved is meaningful, explained genealogist Allison Martin Krensky. But there's something special about finally giving answers to a family that's waited nearly half a century. Most importantly, Layla Mae Johnston was no longer just another cold case number. Her story, while tragic, had finally found its ending. The kind grandmother who spent her life helping others, who sewed clothes for her grandchildren, and tended her garden with loving care, had at last received a measure of justice. As this chapter closes, new questions emerge. How many other killers are out there, their crimes hidden behind the passage of time? How many other families are still waiting for answers? And how many more secrets are locked away in preserved DNA samples, waiting for science to give them voice? If you've been moved by Layla's story, hit that like button and subscribe to hear more tales of cold cases solved through groundbreaking science. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Do you think genetic genealogy is the key to solving more decades-old crimes? And what other cold cases would you like to see us cover? Remember, as Layla's case proves, it's never too late for justice. Sometimes it just needs a little help from modern science to find its way. Stay tuned for our next video, where we'll explore another fascinating case